Pay attention to the Muslim man kneeling on his prayer rug. His name is Hussein. He's praying outside St. Mary's Catholic School when a sister approaches. Then, something extraordinary happens in the sky above.
My name is Hussein, and on October 3rd, 2023, I was a 29-year-old devout Muslim living in Detroit. That Tuesday afternoon changed everything I believed about God and faith. What happened outside St. Mary's Catholic School defied all explanation. I'm sharing this testimony because staying silent would dishonor what Christ did for me. I was born into a faithful Muslim family in Detroit, raised in a household where faith wasn't just practiced, but lived every single day. My father, an imam at our local mosque, would wake us before dawn for Fajr prayers. The sound of his voice reciting the Quran became the soundtrack of my childhood. My mother wore her hijab with pride, teaching me and my three sisters about modesty, charity, and submission to Allah's will. Prayer rugs were spread across our living room floor 5 times daily, and the call to prayer from our mosque echoed through our neighborhood like clockwork. For 29 years, I never questioned this rhythm. I memorized verses from the Quran in Arabic, attended Friday prayers religiously, and observed Ramadan with the discipline my father demanded. During Hajj, when I was 25, I felt connected to millions of believers worldwide as we circled the Kaaba together. That pilgrimage should have been the pinnacle of my spiritual journey, and for a while it was. But somewhere in the months leading up to October 2023, cracks began forming in the foundation of my faith. It started subtly. During morning prayers, my mind would wander to mundane concerns instead of focusing on Allah's greatness. The Arabic words I had recited thousands of times began feeling hollow, like empty vessels carrying no meaning. I found myself going through the motions of washing, bowing, and prostrating without the spiritual connection that had once filled my heart with peace. The verses that used to comfort me during difficult times now felt distant and cold. I told myself this was temporary, perhaps a test of my devotion that Allah was placing before me. Every devout believer experiences periods of spiritual drought, my father had often said during his sermons. But weeks turned into months, and instead of drawing closer to Allah, I felt myself drifting further away. My prayers became mechanical recitations rather than heartfelt communications with the divine. The 5 daily prayers that had once anchored my day now felt like burdensome obligations I rushed through to satisfy religious duty. The spiritual emptiness grew more pronounced during evening prayers. As I faced Mecca in our family's prayer room, surrounded by calligraphy bearing the 99 names of Allah, I felt nothing. The peace that should have filled my heart was replaced by a gnawing sense of incompleteness. I began questioning whether my prayers were even reaching heaven, whether Allah was listening to the desperate pleas I whispered between the required verses. Sleep became elusive as doubts I had never entertained began creeping into my consciousness during the quiet hours before dawn. My daily routine included walking past St. Mary's Catholic School on my way to the automotive plant where I worked as a quality inspector. For years, I had barely noticed the red brick building with its modest bell tower and simple cross adorning the entrance. It was just another structure in the urban landscape of Detroit, no different from the dozens of other buildings I passed during my 20-minute walk to work. But sometime in late September 2023, that school began capturing my attention in ways I couldn't explain or understand. The pull wasn't logical or reasonable. Every morning as I approached the school grounds, something deep in my spirit would stir with an unfamiliar longing. I found myself slowing my pace as I walked past the playground where children laughed and played during recess. The sound of their joy contrasted sharply with the spiritual heaviness I carried in my chest. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of nuns in traditional habits moving through the hallways, their serene faces visible through classroom windows as they taught their students. Now, ask yourself this question: have you ever felt spiritually homeless, even while surrounded by everything you thought represented truth? That's exactly how I felt during those final weeks of September. My family's faith tradition, which had provided structure and meaning for nearly 3 decades, suddenly felt like an ill fitting garment I was forcing myself to wear. The mosque that had been my spiritual home now felt like a foreign place where I was merely going through familiar motions without genuine connection. The spiritual crisis deepened when I began having vivid dreams that made no sense within my Islamic worldview. I would dream of bright lights piercing through darkness, of voices speaking words I couldn't understand but somehow felt drawn toward. Upon waking, instead of feeling disturbed by these dreams, I experienced an inexplicable sense of peace that lasted for hours. This confused me tremendously because nothing in my Islamic education had prepared me for such experiences. Family pressures only intensified my internal struggle. My father, noticing my decreased enthusiasm during family prayers, began questioning my commitment to our faith. He suggested I spend more time at the mosque, perhaps volunteer for community service projects that might rekindle my spiritual fire. My mother expressed concern that I was being influenced by secular Western culture at my workplace, urging me to strengthen my Islamic identity by attending additional Quran study sessions. Their well meaning advice felt like additional weight on my already burdened shoulders. How could I explain to them that the very foundation of our shared faith felt unstable beneath my feet? How could I tell my Imam father that his son was experiencing doubts about Allah's existence, about the authenticity of Muhammad's revelations, about the entire framework of Islamic belief that had shaped our family's identity for generations? The internal conflict became almost unbearable by early October. During the day, I maintained the appearance of faithful observance, joining coworkers for Friday prayers at the small prayer room our plant had designated for Muslim employees. But privately, I was questioning everything from the historical accuracy of the Quran to the theological foundations of Islamic doctrine. These weren't casual intellectual curiosities, but soul deep questions that demanded answers I couldn't find within my traditional framework. Something about those school grounds called to my troubled spirit in ways that defied rational explanation. The building seemed to radiate a peace I desperately craved, but couldn't access through my familiar religious practices. October 3rd, 2023 started like every other Tuesday in my life. I woke at 5:15 a.m. for Fajr prayers, performed my ritual washing in the bathroom I shared with my younger brother, and spread my prayer rug facing northeast toward Mecca. The familiar Arabic phrases rolled off my tongue automatically as I went through the prescribed movements of standing, bowing, and prostrating. But even during those early morning moments, when the house was quiet and my family still slept, I felt that same spiritual emptiness that had been plaguing me for months. After prayers, I dressed for work in my usual khaki pants and polo shirt, grabbed the lunch my mother had prepared the night before, and began my 20-minute walk to the automotive plant. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and fallen leaves crunched beneath my feet as I made my way through the familiar streets of our Detroit neighborhood. For the first 15 minutes of my walk, everything proceeded exactly as it had hundreds of times before. But as I approached St. Mary's Catholic School, that inexplicable pull I had been experiencing for weeks intensified dramatically. Instead of the mild curiosity that usually drew my attention to the building, I felt an overwhelming urge to stop walking entirely. My feet seemed to slow of their own accord as I neared the school grounds. The red brick building with its modest bell tower appeared different somehow, though I couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. The morning sunlight struck the simple cross above the main entrance in a way that made it seem more prominent than usual. I stood on the sidewalk directly in front of the school for several minutes, ostensibly checking my phone for the time, but actually trying to understand why this place commanded such attention from my troubled spirit. Students were arriving for classes, their backpacks bouncing as they hurried through the front doors. A few parents lingered near the entrance, chatting briefly before heading to their own daily responsibilities. Everything appeared completely normal, yet something deep within my chest felt like it was being pulled toward those school grounds. The rational part of my mind reminded me that I would be late for work if I didn't continue walking immediately. My supervisor at the plant was particular about punctuality, and I had already used my allotted sick days earlier in the year when my spiritual crisis had manifested in physical symptoms of anxiety and insomnia. But the spiritual part of me, the part that had felt so empty during months of Islamic prayers, seemed to recognize something sacred about this place. I forced myself to continue walking to work, but throughout my 8-hour shift inspecting automotive parts, my thoughts kept returning to St. Mary's Catholic School. During lunch break, instead of joining my Muslim coworkers for the usual conversations about weekend plans and family updates, I found myself researching the school on my phone. The website revealed it had been established in 1952 by the Sisters of Charity, dedicated to providing quality education rooted in Catholic values. The mission statement spoke about nurturing the whole child, spiritually, academically, and socially. Reading those words stirred something deep within me that I couldn't identify or explain. The concept of nurturing someone spiritually resonated with my hungry soul in ways that months of Islamic study and prayer had failed to achieve. I found myself wondering what it would feel like to experience the kind of spiritual nourishment these nuns promised their students. The thought both intrigued and terrified me, given my family's deep commitment to Islamic faith. As my shift ended at 4:30 p.m., I made a decision that would alter the trajectory of my entire life. Instead of taking my usual route home, I deliberately chose to walk past St. Mary's Catholic School again. The afternoon dismissal was underway, and I watched dozens of children streaming out of the building, their voices creating a joyful symphony that somehow lifted my spirits despite the spiritual darkness I had been carrying for months. Every fiber of my Muslim upbringing told me this was wrong. I had been taught from childhood that Christians were people of the book who had received genuine revelation, but had corrupted it over time. The Trinity was considered shirk, the greatest sin in Islamic theology, because it supposedly compromised the absolute unity of Allah. Seeking spiritual guidance from a Christian institution would be seen as apostasy by my family and community. But my desperate need for authentic spiritual connection overrode these theological concerns. The emptiness in my soul had become so profound that I was willing to risk disapproval, confusion, and even anger from those I loved most. I needed to know whether the peace I sensed emanating from this place could somehow fill the void that Islamic prayer no longer seemed to reach. I stopped walking directly in front of the school and reached into my backpack for the small prayer rug I carried everywhere. This rug had been a gift from my grandmother before her death 3 years earlier, hand woven in Morocco with intricate geometric patterns in deep blues and golds. It had accompanied me on business trips, camping excursions, and every significant journey of my adult life. Unrolling it on the public sidewalk outside a Catholic school felt like both a betrayal of my heritage and a desperate plea for divine intervention. The decision to spread my prayer rug on that sidewalk represented more than just finding a convenient place to fulfill my religious obligations. It was an unconscious admission that my traditional Islamic framework was no longer providing the spiritual sustenance my soul craved. I was essentially placing myself at the intersection of two faith traditions, hoping that somehow in that liminal space I might discover the authentic connection with the divine that had been eluding me for months. School had just dismissed, so there were still a few students and staff members around. But the main exodus had finished several minutes earlier. I positioned my rug carefully, ensuring it faced northeast toward Mecca according to the Compass app on my phone. As I prepared to begin the Maghrib prayer, I noticed a Catholic sister emerge from the main building. Instead of the disapproval or confusion I expected, she simply observed me with what appeared to be respectful curiosity, maintaining a polite distance that honored my religious practice, while clearly remaining available if needed. This unexpected gesture of interfaith respect should have put me at ease, but instead it heightened my awareness that something significant was about to occur. I began my prayer with the familiar words I had recited thousands of times before, but from the very first phrase, everything felt different in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. As I knelt on my prayer rug and began reciting the opening verses of the Maghrib prayer, I immediately sensed that something was fundamentally different about this moment. The familiar Arabic words that usually flowed automatically from my lips felt heavy and strange, as if I were speaking a foreign language for the first time. My voice wavered slightly as I recited Allahu Akbar, and instead of the mechanical comfort I had grown accustomed to during months of spiritually empty prayers, I felt an electric tension in the air around me. The concrete sidewalk beneath my prayer rug began to feel unusually warm against my knees. At first, I attributed this sensation to the afternoon sun that had been heating the pavement throughout the day. But as I continued through the prescribed movement of Islamic prayer, the warmth intensified in a way that defied logical explanation. It wasn't the surface heat you might expect from sun-baked concrete, but rather a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to rise from somewhere far beneath the ground. As I moved into the position of prostration, placing my forehead against the rug in submission to Allah, the warmth spread through my entire body. My hands, pressed flat against the prayer rug, began to tingle with an energy I had never experienced before. The sensation wasn't uncomfortable, but it was so unusual and intense that I found it impossible to concentrate on the Arabic prayers I was supposed to be reciting. Instead of feeling the spiritual connection to Allah that prostration was meant to facilitate, I felt as if some other presence was trying to communicate with me through these physical sensations. When I lifted my head from prostration and looked up toward the sky, what I saw defied every expectation I had about how the natural world operates. The afternoon sky had been overcast when I began my prayer, with thick gray clouds that seemed to promise rain before evening. But as I gazed upward, those same clouds were parting in a way that appeared completely unnatural. It wasn't the gradual shifting you normally see as weather patterns change, but rather a deliberate separation that revealed brilliant sunlight behind the gray cover. The sunlight that broke through the parted clouds wasn't diffused or scattered as you would expect from normal atmospheric conditions. Instead, it formed a concentrated beam of golden light that descended directly toward the school grounds. As I watched in complete amazement, this beam of light arranged itself into an unmistakable cross shape directly above St. Mary's Catholic School chapel. The vertical beam extended from the clouds down to the chapel roof, while the horizontal beam spread across the width of the school building. My hands began trembling uncontrollably as I witnessed this phenomenon. The prayer beads I had been holding slipped from my fingers and scattered across the concrete sidewalk. Every rational part of my mind tried to find a logical explanation for what I was seeing. Perhaps it was an unusual refraction of sunlight through the clouds, or maybe my spiritual distress was causing me to hallucinate. But the physical sensations I was experiencing, the warmth beneath me and the trembling in my hands, felt entirely real and undeniable. I attempted to continue with my prayer, to complete the prescribed verses and movements that constituted proper Islamic worship. But my voice caught in my throat, and the Arabic words that had been second nature to me since childhood simply wouldn't come. It felt as if some invisible force was preventing me from completing my Islamic prayer, while this extraordinary display was occurring above the Catholic school. The spiritual conflict was so intense that I began to feel physically ill. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that Allah wasn't the one calling me to this place. The realization struck me like a physical blow, challenging everything I had believed about my identity, my family's faith, and my understanding of divine truth. For 29 years, I had believed that Allah was the one true God and that Islamic prayer was the only acceptable form of worship. But the presence I felt surrounding me as that cross of light blazed above the Catholic chapel was entirely different from anything I had experienced during decades of Islamic devotion. Sister Catherine, who had been observing my prayer from a respectful distance near the school entrance, suddenly gasped audibly and pointed upward toward the sky. Her reaction confirmed that I wasn't imagining or hallucinating what I was seeing. This Catholic nun, who had no reason to validate my spiritual experience, was witnessing the same extraordinary phenomenon that was completely overwhelming my senses and challenging my theological worldview. The cross of light remained visible for exactly 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity as I knelt there, paralyzed by awe and terror. During those 30 seconds, I felt more spiritually alive than I had during months of Islamic prayer and study. The emptiness that had plagued my soul for so long was suddenly filled with a presence so loving and powerful that I began weeping uncontrollably. These weren't tears of sadness or fear, but rather tears of recognition, as if my spirit was acknowledging something it had been searching for without knowing what it was seeking. When the clouds shifted back together and the cross of light disappeared, I was left kneeling on my prayer rug in a state of complete spiritual upheaval. The warmth beneath me gradually subsided, but the trembling in my hands continued for several more minutes. I felt as if I had been touched by something divine, something far beyond my understanding or control. The Islamic prayers I had been attempting to recite seemed not just incomplete but entirely inappropriate for what had just occurred. I began packing up my prayer rug with shaking hands, my movements clumsy and uncertain. The geometric patterns that had always reminded me of Islamic art and my grandmother's faithful devotion now seemed to belong to a different lifetime. Everything I thought I knew about God, about prayer, about spiritual truth, had been challenged in the span of those 30 extraordinary seconds. Sister Catherine remained near the school entrance, her face reflecting the same amazement I was experiencing. She made no move to approach me immediately, seeming to understand that I needed a few moments to process what had just occurred. But her presence felt like an anchor in the storm of confusion and revelation that was swirling through my mind and heart. In that moment, I understood that my spiritual journey was about to take a direction I had never anticipated or prepared for. As I finished rolling up my prayer rug with trembling hands, Sister Catherine approached me with a gentleness that immediately put me at ease, despite the spiritual turmoil raging inside my heart. Her face radiated a peace that I had been desperately seeking for months. And when she spoke, her voice carried none of the judgment or suspicion I might have expected from a Catholic nun encountering a Muslim man praying outside her school. "Are you all right, son?" she asked, her eyes filled with genuine concern rather than curiosity about what we had both just witnessed. "You look like you've seen something that's shaken you deeply." Her acknowledgement that something extraordinary had occurred validated my experience in a way that made me feel less alone in my confusion. Instead of dismissing what had happened or offering quick explanations, she simply recognized that I was in the midst of a profound spiritual encounter. Instead of the fear or defensive anger that every Muslim instinct told me I should feel toward a Christian religious figure, I experienced an inexplicable sense of peace in her presence. Standing there on that sidewalk, with my prayer rug tucked under my arm and my understanding of divine truths completely shattered, I felt safer with this Catholic sister than I had felt anywhere in months. Her very presence seemed to emanate the same loving energy I had experienced during those 30 seconds when the cross of light blazed above the chapel. "I don't know what just happened," I managed to say, my voice still shaking from the intensity of what I had witnessed. I was trying to pray, and then the sky opened up, and there was this light shaped like a cross. And I couldn't finish my prayers, and I don't understand any of it. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, as if speaking them quickly might help me make sense of the impossible thing I had just experienced. Sister Catherine nodded with a knowing expression that suggested she understood the significance of what had occurred far better than I did. Sometimes God speaks to us in ways we don't expect, she said simply. Sometimes He calls us to places we never imagined we'd go. Would you like to come inside for some tea? I think you could use a quiet place to sit and process what just happened. Every part of my Islamic upbringing screamed that I should decline her invitation immediately. Entering a Christian religious building would be seen as a form of spiritual betrayal by my family and community. The walls would be covered with images and symbols that my faith had taught me to view as idolatrous. I would be surrounded by representations of the Trinity, which Islamic theology considers the greatest possible sin against Allah's unity and sovereignty. But something deeper than theological training urged me to accept her invitation. The spiritual hunger that had been gnawing at my soul for months recognized that this sister possessed something I desperately needed. The peace radiating from her presence offered the possibility of answers to questions I had been afraid to ask. My spirit, which had felt so empty during Islamic prayers, suddenly felt drawn toward whatever truth this Catholic woman might be able to share. I would like that very much, I heard myself saying, surprised by my own words. I think I need to understand what just happened, and I don't think I can figure it out on my own. Walking through the front doors of St. Mary's, Catholic school felt like crossing an invisible threshold between two completely different worlds. The interior of the building was nothing like what I had expected. Instead of the austere institutional atmosphere I had imagined, the hallways felt warm and welcoming. Religious artwork adorned the walls, but rather than feeling threatening or foreign, the images seemed to invite contemplation and reflection. Students' artwork was displayed alongside professional religious paintings, creating an environment that celebrated both human creativity and divine inspiration. Sister Catherine led me to her office, a small but comfortable room filled with books, plants, and religious artifacts that reflected decades of faithful service. A large crucifix hung on the wall behind her desk, and instead of feeling uncomfortable in its presence, I found myself drawn to examine it more closely. The figure of Jesus, arms outstretched in sacrificial love, seemed to embody the same peaceful energy I had been sensing from Sister Catherine herself. She poured tea from a simple ceramic pot and offered me a seat in one of two chairs positioned near her desk. The normalcy of sharing tea with another human being helped ground me after the extraordinary supernatural experience I had just witnessed. As I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, I realized this was the first genuine peace I had felt in months. Tell me about yourself, Sister Catherine said, settling into her own chair with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to listening to troubled souls. What brought you to pray outside our school today? Her question was gentle but direct, inviting me to share as much or as little as I felt comfortable revealing. I found myself opening up to this Catholic nun in ways I had never been able to, with my family, friends, or even my father, who served as an imam at our mosque. I told her about my lifelong Islamic faith, about the spiritual emptiness that had been consuming me for months, about the inexplicable attraction I had been feeling toward the school grounds. I described my growing doubts about Islamic prayer and theology, fears I had never been able to voice to anyone in my Muslim community. Sister Catherine listened without interruption, her face reflecting compassion rather than judgment as I confessed my spiritual struggles. When I finished speaking, she was quiet for several moments, as if carefully considering how to respond to the crisis of faith I had just described. Hussein, she said, using my name with a respect that surprised me. I believe what happened outside today was Jesus calling you to himself. You've been searching for authentic connection with God, and he's been preparing your heart to receive his love in a new way. Her words pierced through the confusion in my mind like a beam of clarity. She continued, Jesus doesn't want to take away your faith. He wants to fulfill it. Everything you've been seeking through Islamic prayer, everything your soul has been hungry for, can be found in a personal relationship with Christ. The way she spoke about Jesus wasn't academic or theological, but deeply personal, as if she was describing someone she knew intimately. For the first time in months, the spiritual emptiness that had been consuming my soul began to fill with something I could only describe as hope. Sitting in Sister Catherine's office, surrounded by crucifixes and images that my Islamic upbringing had taught me to fear, I felt an overwhelming sense of spiritual clarity that had been absent from my life for months. The words she had spoken about Jesus fulfilling, rather than replacing my faith, resonated in my heart with a truth I could no longer deny. Everything I had been searching for through Islamic prayer, every spiritual hunger that had driven me to desperation, seemed to find its answer in this small Catholic school office. I want to know Jesus, I heard myself saying, the words emerging from a place deeper than conscious thought. I don't understand what happened out there today, but I know it was real, and I know it was Him calling me. As those words left my lips, I felt a weight that I hadn't even realized I was carrying begin to lift from my shoulders. The spiritual burden that had made every Islamic prayer feel hollow and meaningless suddenly dissolved. Sister Catherine smiled with the joy of someone who had witnessed countless encounters between searching souls and divine grace. Would you like to pray with me right now? She asked gently. Not an Islamic prayer or a Catholic ritual, but just a simple conversation with Jesus, asking him to reveal himself to you personally. The invitation felt both terrifying and irresistible, like standing at the edge of a cliff and being invited to trust that there were wings waiting to carry me safely to the other side. Right there in that office, with my back turned to Mecca for the first time in my adult life, I bowed my head and asked Jesus Christ to show me who he truly was. The prayer that came from my heart was unlike any religious recitation I had ever performed. Instead of formal Arabic phrases prescribed by Islamic law, I found myself speaking directly to Jesus in my own words, pouring out months of spiritual frustration and desperate longing for authentic connection with the divine. Jesus, I prayed, my voice breaking with emotion, if you're real, if you're the one who created that cross of light above this school, please help me understand what you want from me. I've been so empty for so long, and nothing in my Islamic faith has been able to fill that emptiness. If you can give me the peace I've been searching for, I want to follow you. As I spoke those words, something extraordinary happened inside my chest. The crushing weight of spiritual emptiness that had been my constant companion for months suddenly lifted completely. It felt as if invisible chains that had been binding my soul were breaking away one by one. A warmth that had nothing to do with temperature spread through my entire body, starting from my heart and radiating outward until every cell seemed to be filled with divine love. Sister Catherine placed a gentle hand on my shoulder as I wept tears of relief and overwhelming gratitude. "Welcome to the family of God," she whispered. "Jesus has been calling you for months, preparing your heart for this moment. Everything you've been through, all the emptiness and searching, was leading you to this encounter with His love." The transformation was immediate and undeniable. The God I had been trying to reach through Islamic prayer for 29 years suddenly felt closer than my own heartbeat. The Jesus I had been taught to view as merely a prophet had revealed himself as the living Son of God, who loved me personally and intimately. Every prayer I had ever offered, every spiritual hunger I had ever experienced, had found its ultimate fulfillment in this moment of surrender to Christ. Sister Catherine spent the next hour explaining the basics of Christian faith, but not in the academic way I might have expected from a religious teacher. Instead, she spoke about Jesus as if describing a beloved friend, sharing stories from the Gospels that illustrated his compassion, his sacrifice, and his desire for personal relationship with every human being. Each story she told seemed to address specific doubts and questions that had been troubling my heart during my months of spiritual crisis. "What happens now?" I asked, suddenly aware that accepting Jesus as my Lord and Savior would have profound implications for every aspect of my life. My family, my community, my identity as Hussein, the faithful Muslim son, would all be challenged by this decision. The courage I felt in Sister Catherine's presence might not sustain me when I faced the inevitable opposition from those I loved most. "Now you begin the most beautiful journey of your life," she replied, with confidence born from years of shepherding new believers through their first steps of faith. "It won't always be easy, especially given your family background, but Jesus will never leave you or abandon you. You're not walking this path alone." She connected me with Father Rodriguez, the parish priest, who would be able to provide guidance about baptism and formal entry into the Catholic Church. The conversation about telling my family was the most difficult part of that entire afternoon. Sister Catherine helped me understand that my conversion to Christianity would likely be viewed as betrayal by my parents and siblings who had invested decades in raising me within Islamic faith. My father's position as an imam would make my decision particularly painful for the family, potentially affecting his standing within our mosque community. "Pray before you tell them," she advised. "Ask Jesus to prepare their hearts and give you the right words. Remember that your family loves you, even if they can't understand or accept your decision immediately. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is remain faithful to truth, even when it's costly." Her wisdom came from years of counseling converts who had faced similar family crises. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself whether you've ever faced a decision that required choosing between family approval and spiritual truth. That's exactly the crossroads where I found myself as I prepared to leave St. Mary's Catholic School that evening. The joy of finding authentic relationship with Jesus was tempered by the knowledge that this discovery would likely cost me relationships with the people who had shaped my entire identity. But as I walked home through the familiar streets of Detroit, carrying my prayer rug and my completely transformed understanding of divine truth, I knew with absolute certainty that I could never go back to the spiritual emptiness I had endured for months. Jesus had filled the void in my soul that Islamic prayer had been unable to touch, and no amount of family pressure could make me pretend that hadn't happened. The most difficult conversation of my life was waiting for me at home, but I was no longer facing it alone. 3 months after that life changing afternoon outside St. Mary's Catholic School, I stood in the same baptismal pool where countless others had publicly declared their faith in Jesus Christ. The warm water reached my waist as Father Rodriguez prepared to lower me beneath the surface, symbolically burying my old life as a Muslim and raising me as a new creation in Christ. Sister Catherine stood at the edge of the pool, tears of joy streaming down her face as she witnessed the completion of the spiritual journey that had begun with our conversation in her office. The path from that October afternoon to my baptism had been the most challenging and rewarding 3 months of my entire life. Telling my family about my conversion to Christianity was indeed the most difficult conversation I had ever faced. I chose to speak with my parents first, sitting in our living room where we had shared thousands of family prayers throughout my childhood. The same prayer rugs that had been my connection to Islamic faith for nearly 3 decades were spread across the floor as I prepared to shatter everything my family believed about my spiritual identity. I need to tell you something that's going to be very hard for you to hear, I began, my voice trembling, despite the peace Jesus had given me about this decision. I've become a Christian. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I've accepted him as my Lord and Savior. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode, and the silence that followed felt like an eternity. My father's reaction was exactly what I had feared. His face went through a series of expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief to profound grief. As an imam who had dedicated his life to Islamic teaching, my conversion represented not just a personal betrayal, but a fundamental challenge to everything he had invested his identity in. How could you abandon Allah? He asked, his voice broken with a pain I had never heard before. How could you commit shirk by worshipping a man as God? My mother's response was even more devastating because it was quieter. She simply began weeping, the kind of deep, silent sobs that come from a mother who feels she has lost her child. For her, my conversion meant that we would no longer share the same eternal destiny, that the son she had raised in Islamic faith was now walking a path she believed led to damnation. The theological implications were too overwhelming for her to process rationally. My 3 sisters reacted with a mixture of anger, confusion, and desperate attempts to convince me that I was making a temporary mistake that could be corrected through more intensive Islamic study. They suggested I was having a mental health crisis, that the stress of work had somehow made me vulnerable to Christian manipulation. Their inability to accept that I had made a rational, spiritually informed decision was heartbreaking, but not unexpected. The conversation lasted for hours, with my family members taking turns trying to convince me to reconsider what they saw as a catastrophic decision. They quoted verses from the Quran, reminded me of my Islamic heritage, and pleaded with me to speak with our Imam about returning to proper faith, but nothing they said could erase the spiritual transformation I had experienced or the peace that Jesus had brought to my previously empty soul. Some friends in our Muslim community abandoned me immediately when news of my conversion spread. The automotive plant where I worked had several Muslim employees who had been my companions for daily prayers and religious discussions. They began treating me like a stranger, refusing to make eye contact and excluding me from conversations that had once included me as a valued participant. The isolation was painful, but it also helped me understand the cost of following Christ in a way that theoretical knowledge never could have. However, not everyone reacted with complete rejection. A few friends became genuinely curious about what had motivated such a dramatic change in someone they had known to be a sincere and thoughtful Muslim. These conversations gave me opportunities to share my testimony and explain how Jesus had filled the spiritual emptiness that Islamic prayer had been unable to address. While most of these friends didn't convert themselves, some began asking deeper questions about the nature of divine truth. The most devastating consequence was losing my job at the Muslim Community Center, where I had been working part time as a youth coordinator. When the director learned about my conversion, he called me into his office and explained that my position was no longer tenable given my new religious identity. You understand that we can't have someone teaching Muslim youth who has rejected Islam, he said with obvious sadness. It would be confusing and potentially harmful for the children. I understood his position even as it created serious financial challenges for me. The community center had been more than just employment. It had been a place where I felt connected to my cultural heritage and able to contribute meaningfully to younger generations. Losing that connection forced me to confront how thoroughly my conversion had separated me from the Islamic community that had shaped my entire social identity. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself what you would be willing to sacrifice for spiritual truth. The cost of following Jesus was higher than I had anticipated, but the rewards were beyond anything I could have imagined. The peace that had eluded me during months of Islamic prayer became my constant companion. The spiritual hunger that had driven me to desperation was completely satisfied by my relationship with Christ. Father Rodriguez became an invaluable mentor during this transition period, meeting with me weekly to study the Bible and answer the countless questions that arose as I learned to understand Christian theology. His patience with my Islamic background and his deep knowledge of both faiths helped me navigate the theological complexities of my conversion. Through his guidance, I began to see how my Islamic heritage had actually prepared my heart for receiving Christ in ways I hadn't recognized. 3 months after my conversion, I was baptized at St. Mary's Catholic Church with Sister Catherine as my witness. As Father Rodriguez raised me from the baptismal water, I felt the same divine presence that had first called me through the cross of light. Above the school, the congregation erupted in applause and praise, welcoming me into the family of God with a joy that helped heal some of the relational wounds my conversion had created. Today, I serve as a bridge between Muslim and Christian communities in Detroit, helping both groups understand each other better while sharing my testimony of how Jesus revealed himself to a searching Muslim heart. My family relationships are slowly healing as they witness the positive changes that faith in Christ has brought to my life. Some of my siblings have even begun asking questions about my faith, though none have converted yet. I never expected to find Jesus while trying to pray to Allah outside a Catholic school. But God meets us exactly where we are, not where we think we should be. If you're struggling with spiritual emptiness, if you're searching for authentic connection with the divine, I encourage you to be open to however God wants to reveal himself to you. My name is Hussein. I was born Muslim, and today I am a follower of Jesus Christ. I have never been more certain of God's love than I am right now. If this testimony has touched your heart in any way, I invite you to seek Jesus for yourself and discover the peace that can only be found in Him.